Good evening. It's time to get started with our class tonight. If you would be opening your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 10. That's where we're going to pick up our study tonight. 1 Kings chapter 10. We're continuing our look at King Solomon, his life and reign. We looked at the first of those lessons last week, and we'll finish this lesson up this week and possibly get on into looking at a little bit about Rehoboam tonight. But that's where we're going to start in 1 Kings chapter 10. It's good to see everybody. Well, last week where we left off, the temple has just been completed and dedicated. And during the dedicatory address that Solomon offers, God's pleased with the things that Solomon has to say. And he makes some promises to Solomon, establishes a covenant with Solomon, that so long as Solomon remains faithful to God, that temple would continue to have his name attached to it, that the temple would continue to be a sign of honor for that country, that Israel would continue to stand, would continue to retain its position. But if Solomon reaches the point that he turns away from God, there would come a time that temple would fall. And we know that ultimately that happened when Babylon came in and carried the nation of Judah away. Also, part of that, Israel would come to be mocked by the people around them. Now remember, at this time, we talked last week, at this point, Israel is in a position to where they're really looked up to. Solomon has positioned them in a very good place. People are respectful of Solomon, of his wisdom. But God says that if Solomon turns away from that they would become the laughingstock, essentially, of those other nations. Well, where we're picking up tonight, 20 years has passed from the time that construction began on the temple. And you remember that prior to the beginning of the temple, Solomon had made an agreement with the king of Tyre, a man by the name of Hiram. And Hiram had agreed to provide all of the wood that would be needed for the construction of the temple. And after this 20-year period, Solomon provides a gift to the king of Tyre. And that gift is he gives him 20 cities that were located in the region of Galilee. Those cities were ones that were to become now a part of the possession of the king of Tyre. Well, the king of Tyre, rather than being appreciative of what Solomon has done, he sees it almost as a slap in the face. He's not impressed with the gift, and he gave those 20 cities the name Kabul, which in the language of that day, it meant good for nothing. So this partnership, you might say, between Solomon and Hiram does not come to a good end. Hiram does not believe that Solomon has paid him back well enough for all he did in bringing the temple to construction. But we find that even though Solomon has this disagreement or this falling out, you might say, with Hiram, he continues to have the praise of many of the other leaders of the nations around. And we find that the Queen of Sheba hears about Solomon, hears about his great wisdom, and she comes to test him, the text says, with some hard questions. Now, we're not told exactly what all those hard questions were, but she comes with some hard questions, wanting to test the wisdom of Solomon. Well, she comes and she inquires of these questions. He provides satisfactory answers, ones that displayed very well the wisdom that he had. And it caused her, in 1 Kings 10, verses 6 through 9, to make this statement. She says, "It was a true report which I had heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. Happy are your men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. So she meets with Solomon. She recognizes that Solomon is the reason why this nation is at peace. He's the reason why this nation is so richly blessed at this point. And she publicly makes this proclamation, indicating the impression that she had of Solomon. Well then, after making this proclamation, we're told that she then gave as a gift to Solomon a large amount of gold, spices, and precious gems. But the text goes on to say, she said that she gave this to him, the like of which had never been seen before. Now you got to remember the things that we've just read about the construction of the temple. And you think about the great wealth that went into the construction of the temple. But now it's saying this gift that the Queen of Sheba has given to Solomon was the greatest that anyone had ever seen. Folks, that's mind-boggling. It's so unfathomable compared to what we've already seen. But as we talked about last Wednesday night, when we look at this period in the reign of Solomon where he is faithful to God, where the nation is faithful to God, folks, this great wealth is an indicator of the blessings of God. No, it's not saying that everyone who's faithful to God is going to be rich, but what this is indicative of, and remember, God promised Solomon that so long as he remained faithful, he would not only have the wisdom he desired, but that God would bless him with great riches. Well, up to this point, he's been faithful to God. Up to this point, God's kept his promise to Solomon. Solomon has become a very wealthy man, and the nation became very wealthy. But then as we look at verses 14 through 29, and I mentioned this to you as we were concluding last week, what we find here is almost a balanced statement of the income of Solomon. And in my opinion, the reason why this is mentioned is once again to show just how greatly God was blessing not only Solomon, but this nation. Notice it says that his yearly income was 666 talents of gold. Well, this was in addition to what he received from the caravans of traders that would come through. This was in addition to what he received from visiting dignitaries as gifts. This was just his yearly allotment of gold for being king. Well, whenever we think about a talent is basically 75 pounds. Think about how much a gold ring costs today. A ring that might weigh an ounce. 75 pounds made up 1 talent of gold. Solomon's yearly allotment of gold was 666 talents of gold. Folks, based upon the present day price of gold, that's roughly 2.2 billion with a B dollars worth of gold every year. It also says that he made for himself 200 large shields, each containing about 16 pounds of gold. And he made 300 smaller shields, each containing about 5 pounds of gold. He made a throne for himself to sit upon. The throne was made out of ivory and overlaid with gold. The steps leading up to the throne had a lion at the end of each one of the steps. There were 6 steps leading up to the throne. There were lions' heads at each end of each step. So you had 12 lions' heads in total. Folks, truly nothing like this had ever been seen before or has ever been seen again. I mean, this was just this total embodiment of the blessings of this nation. This nation was faithful to God, and God was richly blessing them. But also, it goes on. It says all of Solomon's drinking vessels, all of the things that he would drink out of, were made out of solid gold. And it says the reason for that is because during the reign of Solomon, silver was seen as being worthless. Something that still has such a value today. But during his reign, because of this abundance of gold, silver was seen as worthless. We're told that merchant ships returned every 3 years. And on those ships, they brought more gold, silver, ivory, and exotic animals. All things that were seen as blessings and signs of great wealth and royalty. 1 Kings 10 and verse 23 says that Solomon's wealth and wisdom surpassed all the kings of the earth, and everyone who came to seek his wisdom brought valuable gifts to him. But also during this time, Solomon wasn't just spending the money on himself. He wasn't hoarding up this money. He used much of it in the construction of the temple. He used a lot of it in the construction of his own home. But we also find that he used a lot of this wealth to help build up the nation. He built up a great military during this time. We're told that the military came to consist of 1,400 chariots and 12,000 what we would consider as cavalry soldiers. Those who would either ride on horseback or would ride in the chariots. But the first thing that we see as an indiscretion in Solomon's character. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 16, the children of Israel were forbidden to import anything from Egypt. They were not allowed to have any type of trade negotiations, anything whatsoever, with the nation of Egypt. Well, where do you think Solomon went to get the chariots? He went to Egypt. He went against what the nation had been told that they could and could not do. Now, there are some, and I do not ascribe to this view, but there are some who say that possibly during this time, for the purpose of helping build up the military, maybe this one time God allowed Solomon. Well, the scriptures don't tell us that. That would be speculating for us to say that on this one time occasion that God let that go and let Solomon engage in this. I tend to believe that this was the beginning of the indiscretions in his character. Because up to this point, Solomon was dead set on following God's word. Not going against it whatsoever. I believe that this is where we really start seeing Solomon turn away from God. Well, although Solomon had been blessed by God, I mean, there's no other way to explain it. You look at the way that this nation has been blessed under the reign of Solomon. God has richly blessed Solomon because of his faithfulness. He was provided extraordinary wisdom, extraordinary wealth. But Solomon had a weakness. And this weakness was one that was very, very apparent. And it's one that ultimately would bring about his downfall. Solomon loved women. And not just one woman. Solomon loved many women. 1 Kings 11 and verse 3 tells us that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. 1,000 women. 1,000 partners. 1,000 relationships. But where the real problem arose was where he was getting some of these wives. These were not Israelite women. These were not women who he rightfully was allowed to marry. he was intermarrying with some of the heathen nations that were around. And some of the sources that I looked at, and this would make sense, said that quite possibly one of the ways that some of these neighboring kingdoms or neighboring monarchs would show their appreciation to Solomon for his oversight and his wisdom would be to provide him with one of the daughters of the king, to provide him with someone from the royal family as a bride. You know, that's something that has been quite common among royal families for pretty much from the time that kings first came upon the earth. But what happened was Solomon began to marry women who did not worship God. He began to marry women who were idol worshipers. Well, God became very angry with Solomon because Solomon, more than likely because he was trying to find a way to please these women, he began to have temples constructed to the false gods that they wanted to worship. And so not only did you have the temple to the one true God, you had temples to these false gods that Solomon's wives were devoted to. Well, God became angry with Solomon because this was sinful. It was not permitted. And we find that at this point, God makes a promise to Solomon. He tells him that he's going to take the kingdom away. Just as he had done with Saul prior to his father David becoming king. When Saul turned away from God, God said that he was going to remove the kingdom from him. Well, God tells Solomon that he's going to tear the kingdom away and give it to his servant Jeroboam. Remember that name because we're going to see it again. But he tells Solomon that because of who your father was, because of the faithfulness of David, he says, I won't do this until you've died. He says, I will wait until, Solomon, I'll wait until you have passed from this life, but the kingdom's going to be taken away. But he also makes the promise that he would not allow the entire kingdom to be removed from the lineage of David. And so this is the first time, the first foreshadowing we see of what would eventually take place of this kingdom dividing. God tells Solomon, he said, you know what? Look at all the blessings, look at the wealth, look at the wisdom. You wouldn't remain faithful. And so this kingdom is not going to stay united under you. This kingdom's going to divide. Part of that kingdom is going to go to your servant Jeroboam. But he would allow a descendant of David to continue to rule from Jerusalem. Part of that promise was Jerusalem, the city of David, as long as this kingdom stood, that David's descendants would rule from the city of Jerusalem. Well, you may remember that we talked last week about the fact that this was a rare time of peace. This time of peace was about to come to an end. A man by the name of Hadad the Edomite, he began to cause some trouble for Solomon. But also another man, and I'm probably not going to pronounce this correct, but Hadadezer, or Hadadezer. He was the king of a place called Zobah. He was later going to become the king of a much larger kingdom that would come to be known as Syria. These men were enemies of Israel. They began to grow in strength, and they were about to bring an end to this time of peace. Well, it's during this time of rising threat, during this time when, yes, the kingdom is still peaceful for the time being, but war was on the horizon. It's during this time that Solomon dies. Solomon does not live to see that time of peace come to an end. Solomon dies after having reigned for 40 years. And we're told that he was buried in Jerusalem and his son Rehoboam rose to the throne. Well, let's look just briefly at a couple applications that we see from the life of Solomon. First off, folks, we, regardless of our position, regardless of any authority that we may have, folks, we have to be willing to admit our shortcomings. When the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at the beginning of his reign, Solomon humbly admitted to God that he recognized that he was not suited for the task. Remember, he describes himself as a little child. And by this, he's talking about his understanding and his maturity, his ability to lead. He's telling God, he says, I know I'm not prepared for this. And this is when God offers to grant him, I hate to use the terminology, but grant him one wish or grant him one blessing. And he asked for wisdom. He asked for the ability to rightly lead that nation. And that humility on the part of Solomon so impressed God that God not only blessed him with the wisdom that he desired, but also blessed him with great wealth. But we need to realize, just as James tells us in James 4 and verse 10, that the way that we're going to be blessed by God, the way that we will be seen in a favorable light by God, folks, we have to humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord. We have to recognize our shortcomings and our dependence upon God. Okay, one more application. Folks, we cannot allow pleasure and selfish ambition to become our primary focus in life. Last Sunday night in our devotional thought, I brought into comparison here the book of Ecclesiastes and the things that are revealed to us there by Solomon himself and how he had reached a point in life where that was what he was devoted to. Pleasure and selfish ambition. And he tried everything under the sun to try to find something that would satisfy that lust within him. But it was only when he came to the realization that could only be found in faithfulness to God. That was when he found the peace that he desired. That was when, and as I mentioned last week, I truly believe, based upon what we read in the book of Ecclesiastes, that later in Solomon's life he came back to God. I think that the book indicates that. That although he went astray for a while, although he worshipped false gods, although he became a very worldly person, he came to the conclusion at the end of his life that the whole duty of man is to fear God and keep his commandments. Folks, that doesn't sound like someone that's still a rebel from God. I think that Solomon came to himself, came to realize the error of his ways, and departed from this life in a favorable state. Okay, any questions about Solomon before we move into Rehoboam? Okay, well, beginning with Rehoboam, we're going to find this united kingdom being no more. The kingdom very quickly is going to divide, and we're going to find that they're going to remain divided for about 300 years with one nation and almost 400 years with another nation, before ultimately both of those nations are destroyed. The northern nation of Israel is going to be destroyed by Syria. Judah, the southern kingdom, is going to be allowed to exist for about 100 years longer. The reason for that is because they went through periods of faithfulness. They had some faithful kings that brought them back to God and allowed them to continue to survive for a while longer. But ultimately they too were going to fall. And they were going to be destroyed by Babylon. Now what we're going to do as we move forward in this study, we're going to jump back and forth between Israel and Judah. We're going to go in somewhat of a chronological order, but we're going to do this based upon the times when these individuals were on the throne. And if you look at the chart that's on the front of the book, if any of you don't have any of the books and want one, there's still some on the table in the back. But that will kind of give you an idea of the timeline that we're going to be looking at. But I'm going to try to keep things as clear as possible for you. It does get confusing sometimes, because you're going to find that there are times when both kingdoms have kings by the same name. You're going to find that there are instances where if you don't go back and read actually what's taking place, you're not going to know which king's being talked about. And so we're going to try to keep all of that straight, and I'm going to help you with that as we go along.